All right. This is Steve Grumbine with Real Progressives. Tonight, bringing back old friend Tim Canova in a battle royale down in South Florida against Debbie Wasserman Schultz. As many of you know, Tim departed the Democratic Party amongst a lot of shenanigans and is taking on the incumbent from outside the duopoly. Without further ado, let me bring on my friend, Mr. Tim Canova. Welcome to Real Progressive, sir. How are you tonight?
Steve, I'm doing well, thanks. It was a busy day. We were out there canvassing our district, walking door to door. So I haven't had a chance to shower, still wearing a campaign T-shirt, but it was a good day out there.
Well, your hair looks good.
I'll tell you this. I said last campaign, and I say it this time, no matter how hot and humid it gets here in South Florida, we have one big advantage. And that's that I'm never going to have a bad hair day.
You'll never have you always are photo ready. You can always give the double guns. That's great. Okay, so one of the things that I was really wanting to dig into, we've talked about a lot of different things, but this one is really sticking in my craw because, as you and I have known, we've been on parallel journeys for a couple of years. You've been doing this a lot longer than me, but since we've gotten to know each other, a lot of things have changed, yet a lot of things have stayed exactly the same or worse. And, there was some momentum that you had as you felt like you had the backing and the ability to take on Debbie Wasserman Schultz within the party in a primary challenge. Obviously, the Democratic Party did not seem to take kindly to that. What the hell is going on with the Democratic Party right now? I mean, we've obviously known they're not exactly what you would call a great party, but they've doubled down on this thing here recently with what they did with the whole, you got to be a bleeding heart, vote blue no matter who before you get into the, what is going on, man? It's absurd to see how little choices we actually do have right now.
Yeah, it's pretty sad. And I don't criticize any of my friends who are still, trying to reform the Democratic Party from within. Maybe they'll have more success than I had trying to do that here in Broward County. Maybe they'll have more success than they've had up until now. But to me, it seemed to be a losing battle, and one losing battle after another. We had our doubts about the final tally of votes in our August 2016 primary, and we tried to verify the vote by inspecting the ballots. And that whole ordeal was really the last straw for me with the Democratic Party, both locally and statewide and nationally. And I don't want to, go into great detail unless you or your viewers want more detail. But the long and short of it is, we were forced to file a lawsuit to inspect those ballots, and while the lawsuit was pending, the Broward County Supervisor of Elections simply destroyed all of our paper ballots in violation of federal law, punishable by up to a year in prison, punishable by, under state law as a felony by up to 5 years in prison, and destroyed evidence in an ongoing lawsuit. And when that all came out, first of all, we had it on videotape depositions, and we circulated it all over with party officials, and I was asking them to simply join me in asking for an investigation, and I didn't even get a response from any of these party officials. And to me, that was the last straw. When it showed nothing had changed since 2016, that they're willing to look the other way on something. This isn't something trivial. The right to vote and to have our ballots counted is probably among the most fundamental rights in a democracy. And when that right is taken away from you, you really don't have a democracy. So at that point, I decided I was going to run as an independent, which it's been a very good move for us. A lot of folks have stepped up to support this campaign as an independent, as opposed to running in a closed Democratic primary again. And I can tell you that Wasserman Schultz and her machine are worried. They're worried for good reason. They now have to face us in a general election in a district that has an awful lot of non-party affiliation voters, an awful lot of indies. And I'll tell you, what they're doing is they've started a whispering campaign that Tim Canova is going to be another Ralph Nader, and it's going to open the door for a Republican to get this seat. And it's just pure BS, because I'll tell you, they gerrymandered this seat for Wasserman Schultz so that registered Republicans are only 25% of the voters here. Non-party affiliation, indies like me, 35%. And Democrats are about 40%. So the last campaign, if you believe the numbers, the final numbers to be true, and I got to say, I think we might have done a lot better than those final numbers, given they felt they had to destroy the ballots, and given what our final field numbers were showing. But if we come anywhere close to 40% of Democratic votes, we're going to win this in a big way, because we'll get a lot of those indie votes. And it will be the first indie representative in the House of Representatives. In the Senate, you've got Bernie Sanders and I believe the senator from Maine, Magnus King. But in the House, there are no indies. And I hope that this is going to be the route for progressives in the future, because running in closed Democratic primaries in particular, very tough. The incumbent gets shielded from debates. The party is quite fine with that. They make sure that their corporate allies and their media allies shower them with money and with a lot of media attention. And then they marginalize and ignore challengers like me to the point where it's hard for me to even get up at a Democratic Party event and, speak for a minute or two. I've been going around saying that for many voters, many Democratic voters in our district, they don't know me as Tim Canova. They know me as that man, as in keep that man away from the microphone. Don't let that man speak. This is the Democratic Party. They don't want vibrant debates and discussions on the issues. I think this is a party, and I've said it many times, that's corporate owned at the highest levels, and they have a primary mission and a secondary mission. Their primary mission is to stop progressives in primaries, to prevent us from taking over the party, to keep the party corporate. Their secondary objective is to win against Republicans, but it's only secondary. If they can do that, that's great. If not, their donors are quite pleased with them anyway.
Gee, many Christmas. Tim, I looked at you way back when, and I thought, this guy has the chops to be president. You've got the president, you've got the presence to be president. And there's only a couple people that I've met in real time that I feel like have that kind of whatever. And you've got that it factor. The people in South Florida, obviously, like pretty much anywhere in the US, are kind of creatures of habit. You've got people that are familiar with names, familiar with parties. There's safety and security and the same old thing. Even as much as they may say they want new, they always seem to fall back to things that it's like the devil I know versus this fearful future of possibilities. How does an independent in this existing culture overcome that complacency, the fear factor of the Republicans are coming, and all the other things that they throw out there? I mean, you obviously have all the credentials in the world you need. You obviously have positions that are clearly laid out, clearly articulated, repeated in a track record of demonstrating that. Anybody that wants to know where you stand, it's really quite plain. It's not hard to find out. What will it take to take someone like you, who I believe has presidential chops, to be able to overcome that duopoly mindset? It seems oppressive.
Steve, I got to first say thank you for thinking of me that way, and to say that I don't really think of myself that way. I have not been able to look beyond the next election. I would be quite fine in taking out Debbie Wasserman Schultz, and if I have a short congressional career and I only serve a term or two, that's fine with me. I don't think it's healthy for members of Congress and the Senate to be on Capitol Hill for 20 and 30 and 40 years. I never was for term limits before, but at this point, I've really come around to believing in it. I just think there is this permanent government in Washington that they're more cozy with the political consultant class and with the lobbyists than they are with their own constituents, and they speak out of both sides of their mouths. So I'm not looking, I don't have those kinds of ambitions or aspirations. I really think I will be doing a great public service if I can simply remove this one Debbie Wasserman Schultz from office. And, you know, if that's accomplished, yeah, I suppose I can think of other things then. But right now, you know, what will it take, though, for somebody like me to beat Wasserman Schultz is your real question. And I must say that having been through this experience where all of our paper ballots were destroyed with impunity so far, there's been no consequences. The supervisor has not been fired by the Republican governor, the Democratic supervisor. She is not, as far as we know, under a criminal investigation right now by the Department of Justice or by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. It's beyond troubling when Republicans seem to be washing the dirty laundry of Democrats and vice versa. It's almost like the mafia, where they divide things up geographically, and I guess they'll give the Democrats free reign to steal votes and rig elections in Broward, as long as the Democrats do the same for Republicans elsewhere. Our final field numbers showed a far different result, quite frankly. It showed us heading to a comfortable win. Now, their field numbers, you don't know what sense to make of them. Anything could happen in the voting booth. And I didn't go around saying it was stolen. I just said I simply wanted to inspect some ballots and verify the vote. For that, I was called a sore loser and a conspiracy theorist. They don't want folks to verify the vote. They don't want losing candidates to ask those questions, to simply inspect ballots. And they make it very difficult to do it. How many losing candidates over the past 2 years, 3 years, have actually asked to inspect ballots and to verify the vote? I don't know of others, and it bothers me. You know, I point to the presidential election, the primary that was so badly rigged in so many states. And maybe the most telling example is what happened in New York, simply because the New York City Board of Elections admitted in a consent decree to purging over 200,000 citizens from their voting rolls prior to their presidential primary. And you know what their punishment was?
I'm afraid to ask.
That they admitted to purging 200,000 voters. That was it. There's nobody lost their job. There's no criminal prosecution. So if you sweep these irregularities, I don't know what else to call them, purging of voters, voter suppression, perhaps manipulation of software. If you just sweep that under the rug, you're absolutely normalizing it to occur time and time and time again. So what I've learned in the past year and a half of looking at the results of my own race and of fighting to see the ballots is that it's so easy to manipulate the results of an election if you can manipulate the software of the voting machines. Everybody knows it at this point. Those voting machines can be hacked by foreign or domestic sources. The software can be manipulated, and the citizens have no way, quite often, to review those results in any meaningful manner. Now, when the Supervisor of Elections destroyed our ballots, she's been saying publicly there's really no harm to Tim Canova or anyone else because we have digital scanned images of the ballots. And a lot of people are likely to say, oh, okay, it's digital scanned images. It must be just as good. Those digital scanned images can be altered by software manipulation. You can replace ballots before doing the scanning. This supervisor showed no chain of custody for the scanned images. First, she told us she did not do scanned images, and then a year later, suddenly she had scanned images. So it makes me think, when I see Dennis Kucinich losing by a 2-1 margin in Ohio, did he really? Are any of these results how confident are we? Are we able to verify the votes? I think our election system is a national disgrace. Yes. All over Europe, they have banned the electronic voting machines, and they have paper ballots. They're counted by hand in public. And, you know, when you are employing so many citizens to publicly count votes, it's transparent and it's verifiable by its very nature. I think we'd be better off doing what they do in Afghanistan and dipping our fingers, our thumbs in ink. That's more transparent and verifiable than what we have with these voting machines. These voting machines are a joke and a disgrace.
Yeah. We looked at blockchain in the past, and blockchain is an obvious opportunity for us to leverage a technology that allows for some security, if you will. I understand the paper ballots, but I think to myself, if you're just talking about scantrons without any kind of, what's the right word I'm looking for? Any kind of uniqueness or any kind of disclaimer or, hey, this is yours, without a name, without something on there to say, yes, that's my vote. I don't know. I don't see the value there. I don't see enough value there. It's better than what we have now. We have zero transparency, but I think the entire voting system right now leaves so much to be desired. It allows for bad stories to be told. It allows for myths to be spread. It allows both true stories and just completely discombobulated stories, and nobody knows anything. And what you've really done, if you get rid of all the different versions of the truth, is you've got a system that is completely undermined and is no longer trusted or trustworthy by the citizens. So there's no way that people can have any confidence that the people that are quote unquote elected are actually, in fact, actually elected. It doesn't make sense.
It doesn't. And, you look at the public opinion polls as far as where voters are on the issues. Supermajority wants Medicare for all. In the state of Florida, supermajorities wanted medical marijuana and solar energy. I think the people are so far out ahead of the political class, and that makes sense. The politicians are essentially heavily influenced, if not bought and paid for, by corporate money. Of course, they're going to be out of step with the people. And yet the people's candidates keep losing these elections. And they lose them under mysterious circumstances, such as what happened to Bernie and certainly what happened to our campaign. It's no little thing, again, when paper ballots are absolutely destroyed. So the election experts I talk to, and there are many of them, tell me that without the paper ballots to compare the digital scanned images to, the digital scanned images are pretty much worthless. So, I think it's two questions, Steve. One is, how can progressives like us win elections? And two, how can progressives like us make sure that our elections are not stolen when we win them? And those are they're two different questions. And look, I'm more confident of the first question. We win elections by talking about the real issues that matter to real people. You can turn on MSNBC, and for a solid year, it's all Russia, Trump, Putin, Russia, Trump, Putin. Most people in this country, I'll tell you, this. They're worried about paying their bills. They've got stagnant incomes, a crappy job market that's not reflected by the unemployment rate, the official rate. They've got rising costs for healthcare, for higher education, for housing, for rents, and they've got, I think, just stagnant wages and terrible job prospects, and declining public schools K-12. There's nothing good happening for most working folks and families, for the majority of the American people. They say a majority of the people now have less than $400 in their life savings, not enough to deal with a major healthcare crisis or maybe even a major car accident not covered fully by insurance. So you can imagine how for some folks, a healthcare crisis or some other kind of crisis can lead to eviction, homelessness. It's a national disgrace when we look at the condition of our veterans and the high unemployment, the high homelessness, and the addiction rates among veterans, people who went to serve our country and put their bodies and their lives in harm's way. So, I think as long as progressives stick to the issues that matter to people, we're going to win elections. How do we make sure the elections are not stolen, that the ballots are actually counted and preserved? That's a much tougher question.
I couldn't agree with you more. It's interesting. I spoke at what turned out to be a Trump rally. I had no idea it was a Trump rally, and I show up there. And, I was like, oh, God, I got to completely revamp what I'm talking about. But the things that I spoke about at that rally resonated with them, and they were all progressive. There wasn't one thing I said that wasn't completely a progressive stance. Yeah. I talked about how can we have veterans that we don't provide health care for? How can we have kids burdened with $100,000 student debt on their backs. How can we just suddenly come up with $800 billion to fund the military and not one person raised an eyebrow about inflation or devaluing your dollar or anything else crazy like that? Why? And they all just like, oh my goodness, hey, this guy, okay, he's a progressive, but okay. And I thought to myself, these are winning issues no matter what side of the aisle you're on. No matter where you're at, the progressive agenda, if spoken in terms that people understand, transcends party lines.
Absolutely.
And I think that it's tremendous value. And you represent every one of those things, Tim. I mean, I don't think there's enough people willing to take that stance. I think many fall into that, we got to beat them over there kind of thing. But talk a little bit about the progressive agenda, this vaunted progressive agenda that shows up in different ways in different places, and its transcendency across party lines. Because I think that to get the progressives out, they've got to believe there's a chance to win. And they also have to believe that there's more than just beating the other guy. Mm-hmm. And I think that you're nailing it. Talk about the issues, stay on the issues. We got to teach people what the issues are. We got to teach them how to defend the issues so that they can be our best allies out in the streets. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts there on what the actual progressive agenda is?
Yeah, I've long thought that the centerpiece of any progressive agenda is a full employment program. So the national jobs guarantee, a federal jobs guarantee, to me has always been a no-brainer. I've been advocating it for so many years. And I don't think it's incompatible with a basic income guarantee. I don't see why you can't have both. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal put 11 million Americans to work during the 1930s, during the Great Depression, in public jobs programs. That's what's been missing for decades now. We've been on austerity for decades, and the twin brother of austerity is privatization. When you have enough austerity, you see a deterioration in public services, whether it's K-12 schools or the waterworks, and it opens the door for commercial gain, for privatization of schools, of water and transit infrastructure, of prisons, and the election counting system has been privatized. Let's face it, when those are private companies that are developing the software and the machines, and you're not even allowed to inspect their software, that's privatization. And we trust them to count the votes properly. So we need to fight back against privatization, have a public sector that is fully funded. And I look to history all the time, and it resonates with older folks, and younger folks need to learn the history. I think it's been all too forgotten. We had a Great Depression. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal put people to work rebuilding this economy. And then after World War II, we had the GI Bill of Rights, which in a way was the New Deal on steroids. When 16 million American returning military came back from the war, they were suddenly eligible for tuition-free higher education with living stipends. So people today say, we can't afford tuition-free higher education. Well, why is it that my dad's generation, we could afford it for them and not for us? We're a wealthier country right now. Of course we can afford it. Also on the GI Bill of Rights, low interest loans for mortgages, low interest loans for small business development and startups, healthcare for all veterans. I mean, this is the kind of universalistic conception of citizenship, which I think has been at the heart of progressive thought in this country since Teddy Roosevelt. That if you're an American citizen, you've got certain minimum obligations and duties to your country, but you also have certain rights and benefits by virtue of being a citizen. Now, among the duties should be the duty to vote. It's not. We probably, I'm sure we need a national voting day holiday. It's amazing that Election Day is not a national holiday, but President's Day is. We're honoring presidents. I can't remember the last president worth honoring, to tell you the truth, with a national holiday. But we're not going to have the day off for people to vote. There's so many folks who voting's not even an option. They're too busy working and taking care of their families to then try to get onto a line, on Election Day. Well, we try to make it easier with absentee balloting and early voting sites. I understand that, but the early voting sites are still tough for people who are working. And I really think there should just be a national holiday, and we should be hiring an awful lot of folks to work those polls and count the votes and count the ballots. But back to the agenda, universalistic, jobs for all, health care for all. Franklin Roosevelt talked about it in his Economic Bill of Rights in 1944. And many European countries that are capitalistic economies, but they're mixed market, the social welfare state, Germany, Sweden, Denmark, Holland, Norway, Finland, these countries, they are able to take care of their citizens cradle to grave. They've got a much more equitable distribution of wealth and income, more progressive tax rates. I think this is what would speak to the American people right now.
You know what? I want to hit this thing Myrna Jordan brought up, and I was going to bring this up anyway. So this is just a really, really solid point, I think. There's nothing more corrosive and more economically illiterate than the pay-go. And this is what Pelosi is now advancing, and it had been in play since the Obama era. This is one of the worst rules. It is a political construct. It has no operational reality to it whatsoever. It is completely antithetical to progress, and it will completely kneecap progress for all. To use a term, this to me is the equivalent of the right-wing balanced budget amendment. This is every bit as pernicious, if not worse, because it has no real basis of anything. It's just a rule. And this is the kind of sickness that will impact our ability to have all these wonderful programs we just talked about. This is the kind of thing right here that I think literally just destroys our nation. What are your thoughts on how to overcome this pay-go mindset?
Well, it's funny that mindset doesn't seem to apply when they pass $1.5 trillion tax cut. Don't have to worry about paying for that. Don't have to worry about paying for an extra $100 billion for the Defense Department's budget. But if you're going to talk about Medicare for all, well, Medicare for all should cost us less than the present healthcare system, first of all. But tuition-free higher education, somehow you've got to cut money somewhere else, cut funding somewhere else. No, that's not the way to go. The pay-go is a farce. It's been around a lot longer, I think, than people realize. It goes way back to the 1980s. And what was it? The Graham, Rudman, Hollings budget framework. And my old boss, Paul Tsongas, a Democrat from Massachusetts, and other Democrats bought into even that balanced budget type of mentality back in the 1980s, which I thought was very unfortunate. And this is what reinforces the mindset of austerity and the reality of austerity, and it prevents creative solutions to our problems. I think we need federal subsidies for teacher salaries, K-12, and we need a lot more teachers. And the federal government could solve that problems without breaking a sweat, and yet it's unwilling to do so. So some of our challenge, I think, is to explain to voters, whether we're explaining it through modern money theory or we're explaining it through the prism of American economic history, where we saw, again, the New Deal and World War II, the federal spending and the budget deficit was so much higher as a percentage of the overall economy than it is today. And it didn't lead to a parade of horribles, quite the opposite. The country enjoyed its best economic growth and more equitable distributions of wealth and income and opportunity than we have today. So I do think a lot of our mission is to educate folks on American history and on economic realities like you are doing all the time. I also think that there's room for creative solutions that don't add to the budget deficit. So maybe you could criticize it and say, well, you're playing into the balanced budget mindset. Look, I don't think it is. What I'm driving at is, let's have a national infrastructure bank and let's fund it with the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve can print money out of the blue. They had their quantitative easing programs, which didn't add to the budget deficit. They create $3 trillion, $4 trillion out of thin air. Doesn't lead to budget deficits. They can loan the money at 0.25% interest rates like they did to Wall Street banks and hedge funds. There's so many ways the Fed could fully fund a national infrastructure bank without adding a penny to the deficit. And then on top of that, once the Fed throws $1 trillion or $2 trillion into infrastructure that way, well, look at what the result is. the infrastructure banks start putting people to work. When you take unemployed resources and suddenly give them an income, those become tax-paying resources now. And they say that the Marshall Plan and the GI Bill, huge federal outlays in the 1940s and 50s, more than paid for themselves. I think the estimates are something like 5 times over in the form of higher economic growth rates and higher tax revenues being paid by the folks who essentially were employed in those programs. So I do think that there's lots of ways to fix our economy, and we should not be shackled by the pay-go rules. And Nancy Pelosi is such a joke, really. This is somebody who the only reason she's still the Democratic leader in the House is because all the corporations want her there. Nobody else does. And this is somebody who's made a fortune, I think $100 million for herself as a member of Congress. I think there should be a lot more investigation about how members of Congress get rich while they're there. I know they exempted themselves from insider trading rules. And of course, their very positions allow them to be privy to all kinds of inside information and to trade on it legally. Everyone else has to go away to jail or be prosecuted if they engage in that kind of insider trading, but not for members of Congress. This is what's wrong, and I see it all the time. Again, getting back to the experience in my race with destroyed ballots, what it says to me is there's no reason to have any real faith or confidence in the election system, and the fact that there's not prosecutions says that there's little reason to have a lot of faith or confidence in our criminal justice system at the highest levels. It's almost as if if you're wealthy and politically connected, you're above the law. And we saw this after the Wall Street crisis, where Eric Holder's Justice Department prosecuted nobody of real significance, and there was no real investigative work going on. And I know Holder's doing the rounds now on public radio and everywhere else, saying that they really didn't have any cases to prosecute, that they didn't have any evidence. Well, I'll tell you, just go to Frontline's PBS episode called The Untouchables. Anyone can see it for themselves.
Yes.
There's a reason there were no prosecutions, and it's the revolving door. It's because Eric Holder and Lonnie Brewer, the head of his criminal division, basically sold out the American people and took very lucrative partnerships at law firms that represent these big banksters.
That's right. So, Tim, I want to ask you a question here. So as we look across the country and we see places like Flint, Michigan come up, and we realize the water crisis there. You go throughout the entire nation back when all the infrastructure was literally laid. This stuff is dilapidated all over the country, buildings falling apart, old crappy lead tiles all over the place, lead paint, you name it. Then you go down to Puerto Rico, where there's still completely it's a disaster zone. All of this stuff is completely fixable. And you go and you think about what maintenance across the U.S. would look like, across every aspect from our territories, you name it, our schools, et cetera. Just fixing things, just maintaining them, would create an incredible boom of jobs. And then you add in the idea that regular just basic general accepted accounting principles tell you that there is a deterioration model, a depreciation model, where these things result to a zero value. There should be some way of replacing and retrofitting and all that stuff throughout the entire infrastructure that would keep us in jobs constantly, regardless of anything else that comes up. Why do we not do that? What do you think that is?
I think it's a big corporate agenda. Again, it's the privatization agenda. Why is it that the public schools have collapsed? K-12. I see it everywhere. I see it in Florida. I've lived in several other states in the course of my teaching career. I see it everywhere now. And I don't think that the problems of the schools are like rocket science. I don't think they're that difficult to solve. I think if we pay teachers a lot more, of course, you need a post-tenure review to make sure that the quality of the teachers remain hardworking and all that. But if we pay teachers much more and had a lot more teachers in smaller class sizes and more manageable teaching schedules and allowed schools to once again have art and music and physical education like we had when I was growing up, I think the schools would be fixed pretty quickly. But I see right here in Broward County, the voters passed an $800 million bond a few years ago to fix up the deteriorating schools. And when I say deteriorating, I mean to the point of the physical plant, that there's mold and mildew in classrooms everywhere now and in schoolrooms everywhere, to the point where the local newspapers, like the Miami Herald and the Sun Sentinel, have had articles about how hundreds of children and teachers and staff are sick every week. Well, guess what? The school board has hardly touched the $800 million. I don't know what they're waiting for. To me, it seems like a calculated plan all over the country to privatize the public schools for commercial gain. And let's not keep the waterworks up. Let's let them deteriorate. And I think it's a number of things that are happening, or a number of motivations. I think this is a free rider generation where, I remember Christopher Lasch 30 years ago wrote a book called The Culture of Narcissism. And I think that well describes our country and the time we live in. And it's a very narcissistic generation, or generations that are alive on Earth right now. My generation, the baby boom generation, like no other generation in recorded history, was born into the lap of luxury. The best physical infrastructure ever handed to a generation we were born into. But we never felt an obligation to restore, that what's taken must be renewed. So that's a free rider. That's saying the hell with future generations. We're not going to do the same kind of sacrifice and investments that my dad's generation did to provide for us. We're not going to do that for future generations. And it is sickening. What you said about Flint, right on. Here in South Florida, the pipes are deteriorating all underneath Fort Lauderdale, because I think they're clay pipes from a century ago. And, the pipes themselves are just deteriorating and leaking, and now you got raw sewage in the canals. This is a logistical problem. When I say logistical, what streets do you close down? How do you start rebuilding pipes underneath buildings that are already built? That's an engineering difficulty. There shouldn't be a financial impediment to doing this, though, at all. And instead, how do we expect state and local governments to do infrastructure? We expect them to borrow on the bond markets to pay anywhere from 3 to 7% interest rates right now, I think, which means paying twice, once in principal and once in interest.
I'm so glad you're bringing this up, because that brings me to something that I think is probably the most, I don't talk about it enough, and I want to talk about it now because I think you'll agree with me. I hope you'll agree with me. If not, give me some insight as to where I'm wrong. The number one thing in my mind that's killing states, aside from a corrupt political system right now, is the these unfunded mandates to the states. You got states that are buried in requirements that they either have to tax the hell out of their citizens for, or they have to borrow, like you're saying, these bonds. You look at places like my own backyard in Harrisburg. Harrisburg went bankrupt. You've got places all around the country, these local municipal areas, these state areas that are in dire shape. And they're in a position where they end up having to lower taxes on these, basically give everything away to corporations to lure businesses into their backyard. And then the next minute, those businesses jump ship to go to the next place that'll lower another 0.25%. So we've got the race to the bottom in full force at the state level. Do you believe, I believe, but do you believe that ending all non-funded federal mandates would be a start to bringing about solvency within the states? I mean, if the federal government is going to impose either a regulation or a program or anything else, it should be fully funded by the federal government. What do you think about that?
I could agree with that. I was about to disagree with you until what you just said at the end. I do think the federal government has a role to play in setting some mandates on state and local governments now and then, but they should fund them if they're going to have mandates. And the federal government has so much capability, so much capacity to fund just about anything and everything. It should be doing much more than it is right now.
I think that's what I was getting. I mean, I believe that the federal government, I'm a big gov guy. I'm not a states' rights kind of guy. I just admit it straight up front. So when I think about the federal government coming up with a universal strategy to kick major butt, I know that not all states are the exact same. I know not all needs for each area are exactly the same. And I am definitely for the differing cultures and differing solutions based upon geographics and demographics, et cetera. But I do believe that when the federal government makes a standard that this is the way we're going to attack climate change, or this is the way we're going to attack ending student debt, or however we focus on Medicare or a national health service with dental, whatever. When I think about that, I say, okay, federal government has a place here because they are the currency issuer. They're the ones that don't have the issues that the states do. And this takes me to somewhere like California. On the flip side, instead of being a federal government mandate, state of California tried to pass, or, the people were pushing for a Medicare for all style replacement there in the state of California that would have been California state funded. Right. And California is a very unique place because it's got the economy of many other nations around the world. It's huge. But that said, it's not typical. We have 50 other states. There's only a handful of them that have a similar ability that California or New York have. What is the play there for us as a federal government in the understanding of maybe revenue sharing, or maybe there was some stuff that was going on in the 70s that ended. There was an opportunity for states that were net exporting states, or states that don't have the good inflow of revenues, to have federal funds to raise them up so that they can still have pensions, they can still have roads and schools, et cetera. What is a good solution to if you were elected to Congress, what kind of a solution would you think would satisfy that? Because I hate seeing 3 or 4 states in our country doing very well and the other ones completely in the toilet, because of situations like this race to the bottom. Look at Kansas.
Well, you put your finger on it with revenue sharing. Revenue sharing was the reality from the time of the New Deal until Ronald Reagan put an end to it near the end of the second term, I believe. And revenue sharing is basically the federal government sharing tax revenues with the states. It's a way to prevent a race to the bottom. And I do think we need to go back to more of that revenue sharing, especially in areas such as helping to pay for K-12 education, for instance, but infrastructure as well. And instead, what do you have with infrastructure? The Trump plan is essentially a privatization plan. It tries to put, I think, 80% of the costs onto the states. The states don't have the money to pay for infrastructure. They really don't, because of the race to the bottom. Because if they're going to start raising taxes to pay for anything like infrastructure, anything major, the tax burden goes up and businesses and wealthy folks start moving to other states that have lower taxes. So we have to be one country, not 50 different states, and that's where the federal government should come in. The Constitution gives the federal government definite powers to provide for the general welfare, and then the federal government turns around and says that they can't do it because of the laws of economics.
Article 1, Section 8, baby.
Right, exactly.
All right. So let me ask you this question, because, we have a situation, obviously, where the vast majority of progressives are very, very anti-war. But for the last, forever, we have been in perpetual war. Even if it's not making the front page of the news, we have drones going all over the world, bombing freedom wherever it can be. And we have stealth wars that are going on. We have lots of things going on. I'm not naive. I'm not one of the left that is so anti-war that I don't recognize a need for national security. But that said, I think that, I haven't seen a war that was worthy of being in my lifetime. And I don't know what the parameters for which war should be. I think you have to be thinking through things. You can't just have a knee-jerk, I don't this or I do that. You have to assess things on their own merits. But again, I haven't seen a compelling case for any wars whatsoever. If you were elected to office, what types of things would you use as a criteria for whether we should or should not enter into a conflict?
Well, I'll tell you, I really like what Tulsi Gabbard is doing. She's introduce legislation that would essentially require Congress to fulfill its obligations to approve any war making. That's in the Constitution. And instead, we've got, I think under President Obama, he was droning 7 countries his entire 2 terms in office, and Congress wasn't voting approval. I guess their only way to vote approval was to approve the appropriations bills for the Defense Department, but they weren't actually having discussions and debates on whether we should be going to war in another country. I don't think that's healthy. I think it's an abdication of responsibility. It's not surprising. You know, they say the studies are showing that the average member of Congress spends 30 hours a week dialing for dollars, going to the call centers and dialing on the telephone to wealthy folks to beg for money for their campaigns. Well, if you're spending 30 hours a week dialing for dollars, first of all, you start adopting the mindset of all those wealthy people that you're talking to all the time. But also, do you really have time to have legislative hearings? You know, there were epic legislative hearings, congressional hearings decades ago that helped get us out of the Vietnam War after we were already in that quagmire, that started to expose the rot of that war. We need a Congress that's going to talk about these issues and debate them. Now, what should be the criteria for going to war? It should really be when our national defense is really at risk. I think we need to turn it around and have a discussion about what's an agenda for peace going to look like. I think we need a new Iran arms deal. You know, the Iran nuclear deal, I wasn't crazy about it the first time, mainly because I thought it needed to be part of a more comprehensive regional peace process that did not exist. And I get a lot of folks who I think distort my record on that agreement, but that's yesterday's news anyway. President Trump has withdrawn us from the Iran agreement or announced his intention to abrogate that agreement. I think we need a new agreement, but one that also addresses all of those arms sales into the region. Under President Obama, $100 billion in arms sold to the Saudis. Under President Trump, another $100 billion sold to the Saudis. You know, this is what's happening, is that not just American, but foreign arms makers also are just making a fortune on this perpetual war, this perpetual bloodshed, where every side of every war is a profit opportunity for the arms dealers. I think what we need is a comprehensive global and regional arms control and disarmament agreements. When I was a kid, that was part of the conversation. Of course, the arms control and disarmament then dealt with U.S. and Soviet nuclear ballistic missiles. Now, yes, we need to obviously cover nuclear weapons, but we also need to cover all of those conventional arms that are now destroying, they're killing so many people around the world. When you take a look at the bloodbath in Yemen, in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya, every war of regime change has been a disaster. We need to start talking about how to have a more peaceful world, and that's going to require conversion. There was a lot of talk about conversion at the end of the Cold War, converting Western and Eastern arms-making industries to something more socially useful for civilian use. I'd be much more happy if all these defense contractors with their cost-plus contracts, let them keep their cost-plus contracts, but instead of making weapons of war, let's revive the space program.
Yes.
Okay? You know, to guard against incoming asteroids, the kinds of threats that are 1 in a million, 1 in 10 million. It's probably never going to happen in our lifetimes, but if it does, it's going to end all life on planet Earth, perhaps, right? If a big enough asteroid or meteor, I think asteroid collides with planet Earth. So I do think while we want to, how should I say it, put an end to, destroy the kind of terrible economy and political system we have to be able to replace it with something creative, something that's peaceful and in the interest of progress for all.
It's a beautiful thing that you said there, because we're trying, and man, oh man, I feel like sometimes I'm trying to walk up a grease slide, but we are trying to build relationships around the world. We've got friends in Australia. We've got friends in the UK. We've got friends, really, quite frankly, all over the globe that are feeling the pinch of not only neoliberalism, privatization, and austerity, but are also seeing the effects of climate change and seeing the effects of really, really irresponsible fossil fuel consumption and a resistance to adopting green energy and other sustainable platforms. I think, honestly, sustainability in terms of energy is the great peace inducer. I really believe that is central to altering that, because so much, it's not the conspiracy, it's the fight for resources. It's the fight for natural resources. Hey, we don't want to dig any deeper in the ground in our own turf. Let's go over there. And damn it, if you block us, we're going to bomb you. And that's kind of what I'm seeing more so. And we've got so much sustainable, renewable energy options out there. You know, even these deep water filtration systems to provide clean, fresh water and energy all at once. I mean, it's there. Why are we not doing this? I mean, heck, see, I'm sorry to monologue here, but I wanted to just say, you know, progressives get wrapped around the axle about, well, we don't want the fat cats to win. And no, we don't want the fat cats to win. But I want to be on a planet that is sustaining life. And I will do what I have to do in the meantime to get to utopia, which might involve making some deals with the devil in terms of, okay, we have to maybe subsidize their transition from war machine, like you're saying, to sustainability. Whatever it takes to get us out of this thing, it's going to save lives, it's going to save the planet, it's going to bring about peace. Then we can come after them later. In the meantime, let's solve what's going to kill us now. I believe what's going to kill us now is not having these sustainable energies in place so that we're not going around the world attacking people and trying to pillage theirs. I mean, what do you think, Tim? Am I wrong or am I off?
No, I don't think you're off. And there's a lot of folks who point out that Syria has become such a site of war because of dueling pipeline projects. And there are dueling pipeline projects. You know, the Saudis in the West want to have one pipeline that would come up from the Persian Gulf through Iraq and Syria. And the Iranians and Russia want a pipeline, I believe, that would go from Iran through Iraq and Syria. So Syria becomes a very important place it becomes a war zone to see who's going to get those pipeline projects. At least that is, I think it's beyond a theory. I think it's one of the factors that I think we can all kind of recognize exists. I remember seeing a map of the globe of planet Earth, and each major area, they sort of put a few words over it. You know, the United States, automobiles, Humvees, you know, gas guzzlers. The Middle East, oil, gas, you know, and you see these various parts of the world where it says oil and gas. China producing things, right? Manufacturing. And what struck me was nowhere in this map did it say solar or wind, when in fact, everywhere on the globe is a place for solar and wind, right?
Absolutely.
I look here in Florida, we've got the Sable Trail Pipeline. It's our, basically the Florida version of the Dakota Access Pipeline. This is a 515-mile pipeline that goes from Alabama through Georgia into Florida. And it will be pumping about 1 billion cubic feet of highly pressurized fracked gas a day, probably for export in the form of liquefied natural gas. And it goes through an ecologically very important area of the Upper Floridian Aquifer, the source of 60% of the state's drinking water. It's also sinkhole country. There's a lot of things that can go wrong. And what struck me was a study that came out that if you took half the acreage on that 515-mile pipeline, just half the acreage, and put up solar panels, you'd produce more energy each day than is going to flow through there in the form of fracked gas. So, but what's standing in the way? This, in a way, it's all of our problems. I think a lot of our problems are that we're an old democracy, that it's hard under our political system to get the kind of majority supports in every chamber to have a progressive program. It really does take quite often a crisis and a landslide. And we've got old, dying industries that are not sustainable, that are predatory, that are harmful, but they've got the kind of political clout and support when you have a political system that really runs so much on big money, that these antisocial, anti-democratic types of and warlike industries end up ruling Washington, D.C.
Awful. So, Tim, one final thing before I let you close out. I see a problem. On one hand, we say corruption is like just so bad, we've got to solve it. On the flip side, we turn around and we say, but we've got to elect people that can solve it. Yeah. And then the flip side to that is, hey, our elections, they're rigged and they're not transparent and we can't trust them. And the flip side is that in order to run, we got to have money. But the machine, I mean, it seems like the spiral just goes like this and around and around and around down the toilet. It seems like to me, the best way to solve this is not just worrying about what goes on within the political sphere, but to build power outside of the sphere to put pressure on them. Yes. I don't know of, and this is what my strategy is, quite frankly, because I think that the people need to understand what they're fighting for. It doesn't do any good to run around aimlessly with your fist in the air if you don't know what you're fighting for, because they'll slice right through that. All they have to do is throw up a piece of propaganda on television and you're like, oh my God, off to the next shiny object. Right. We need an informed citizenry. Yeah. And obviously with the propaganda machines of the mainstream media, et cetera, we're not getting the straight truth. We're not getting truth that's meant to serve us. We're getting truth that's meant to kind of placate us, to keep us sedated and in front of our television, and just not effective in terms of pushing for the changes that we need. Yeah. How would you engage citizens to get them to embrace the power they have with or without the election system? Because like I said, I think that our power has to come from within and from without as much as anything to do within the political structure.
I couldn't agree with you.
Oh, sorry about that. There you go. I muted you momentarily. Sorry, go ahead.
I said I couldn't agree with you more. You referred to the mainstream media. That mainstream media is corporate owned. It's just a handful of huge corporate conglomerates that own so many of our newspapers and our TV and radio stations now. And of course, they're going to have their own corporate agenda. And sometimes their agenda is really to follow the government line and not to question government authority. I think that's why it's so important what you're doing and what other folks are trying to do online with essentially an alternative media through social media. What you do, what Jimmy Dore does, an awful lot of folks are out there listening and getting educated. And I think it is vitally important. This is why after my last election, we had and still do have a lot of small donors on our fundraising list. These are folks who can't afford $500 donations. Wasserman Schultz's average donation is over $500. Mine is $20. But we decided to take that fundraising list and create a community advocacy and political organization called Progress for All. And in between my two campaigns, Progress for All raised $250,000 and spent it all. And I'm proud that we spent it all because we spent it on the issues, engaging and educating voters. And it made a difference in Florida, even with the Florida Democratic Party, which last fall had a conference in which it passed the most progressive platform of resolutions in the party's history against fracking, against felony disenfranchisement, on issue after issue, against the Sable Trail Pipeline. It was the agenda that Progress for All was pushing. I don't want to take all the credit for it. I think there are a lot of groups like Progress for All here in the state of Florida and around the country that were pushing that same agenda. So when you're not running for office, when I'm not running for office, I think people have to be committed to that kind of engagement with the grassroots and to be speaking the truth, not just to power, but to the powerless. We need to constantly be educating ourselves and educating voters. Otherwise, nothing changes.
I love that. That right there. That's the big deal to me, because I imagine that Richard Nixon probably did not want to pass the EPA. And I suspect that the large push of awake people back in the, in the heyday, if you will, had something to do with it. I'm sure there's other things, but I like to believe that people had a play in that. So, Tim, with your election coming up, we're out here to educate people as much as anything. I want to give you a closing opportunity to make your pitch.
Well, I appreciate that. It's been a great hour with you, and at no time in the hour did I actually say, please donate money to my campaign. But I need to say that right now. We're having trouble competing with Wasserman Schultz on fundraising. And, I don't look, last campaign, Wasserman Schultz raised about $6 million in her campaign committee, her two PACs, and we raised about $3.8 million. So we were outraised by her, but we either came very close or we won and it was stolen. It was one or the other. We put the money to good use. This time she's outraising us by a lot more than that. And it's because it's so much more challenging to be raising from the grassroots. You talked before about the kinds of problems that ordinary folks are facing all the time. I personally think we're in year 10 of a Great Depression right now for most folks. Almost all the income gains have flown to the top 1%, even the top 1/10 of 1%. Well, that makes it easy for incumbents like Wasserman Schultz to raise money. They're helping the 1%. The 1% are doing better than ever. They can raise a lot of money. But for those who rely on small grassroots donations like I do, like our campaign does, it's so much more challenging right now to get people interested. There are collective action problems where people are like, yeah, I hope Tim Canova wins. I like his campaign. I like what he says, but he'll do okay without my donation. My donation's only $20 afterwards. But if everyone has that attitude, the fundraising falls back, falls down. We need money right now, and it's not even for TV and billboards. We got name recognition like we never had when we started the first campaign. But what we need money for is some of the simple things, is to equip an army of volunteers to go and walk the district door to door. Today, I went out walking with several dozen volunteers. We went into some of the poorer neighborhoods of my district, walking door to door, talking to the voters. We need water, we need food, we need fuel, we need lawn signs, we need literature, we need door hangers. That all costs money, not an arm and a leg. We don't need to raise anything near the kind of money that Wasserman Schultz is raising. Most of what she raises, she's just going to spend on expensive consultants inside the Beltway who will take her money and not give her much in return anyway. 4 years ago, the second-ranking Republican in the House of Representatives, Eric Cantor, faced a challenge by a college professor, David Bratt. Cantor outspent him $5 million to about $300,000, and Cantor lost. And there are times where money is not going to buy you a victory with, in an election. The people want change. The status quo has got to go. Everyone knows it. We need money. We need folks to go to timcanova.com, throw a few dollars, spread the word to others, make this campaign spread on social media, and start funding our campaign. We don't need an arm and a leg, but we do need some resources to take this to her and to win. And when folks invest in this campaign, they should know they're not just investing in a candidate who's articulating and pushing and fighting for a progressive agenda. They're contributing to a campaign that is going to fight to make sure that those ballots are counted, that we have had enough of sweeping these election frauds under the rug, that we have plans to monitor the vote, to audit the vote, and if need be, to challenge the vote and challenge the election. And I've been saying we're going to sue and challenge the election whether we lose by a few votes or by a lot of votes. I just don't trust anything about the official election system at all anymore. So I'm just pleading for folks to take another look at our campaign. We are here fighting for all of you. And, we're not just fighting for a progressive agenda. We're fighting for democracy at this point. And the way folks can help is to go to timcanova.com, donate a few dollars. If you can't afford to donate, or even if you can, come help us with phone banking. If you can come to the district, or if you're listening and you're in the district and in South Florida, please come and help our campaign. This is a people's campaign, and it is catching fire.
Awesome. Tim, this was a wonderful night. I always enjoy having you on. I really appreciate our friendship. You've made me feel like a much more confident person. I want you to know this. This is important. I want to say this. People like you that take an interest in people like myself, having friendships and things like this, it really empowers me and it empowers others. Your touch as a human being exceeds your political call. I want you to know that. And I really appreciate that. You're a good man, Tim Canova.
That's Steve. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, folks, for joining us. This is Steve, Tim Canova from Real Progressives saying have a great night, everyone. Peace.